vous demandez la charité. Quand même un patate et des gratons. Capitaine, capitaine, voyage dans blague, sur l'ordre voisin, montez la charité. Vous ordonnez du joint, vous ordonnez du joint, et on commence ce soir.
we're privileged to have Claire Germain continue our education about all things French. And I'm particularly interested in this talk because my father was born and raised in 1906 at Homer's House, which was a large plantation that was on the edge of the Cajun country. Claire is a professor of law emerita at both the University of Florida and Cornell Law Schools. And she came to the United States to attend law school at Louisiana State University. And she has fond memories of Mardi Gras, Fête d'Eau, dance parties in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. And she and her husband, Stuart, spent 2 weeks in August 2025 in the Canada Maritimes and took a 4-hour ferry ride to the Magdalen Islands to make sure she was providing us accurate information as to the current state of Acadian. So, Claire?
Thank you very much. Can you imagine for a minute being forced out of your house at the point of a bayonet? Then you're herded on ships to an unknown destination. And behind you, your house is burned, your cattle is killed, your farms is set on fire. This is not fiction. This is what happened to a group of some 12,000 Acadians who lived peacefully in Canada in the middle of the 18th century. So now that I have your attention, I wanted to say that things are going to get better, but there will be ups and downs. So I have a personal interest because when I first landed in the US at the age of 22, I went to Louisiana. And I went to law school in Louisiana. I made lots of Cajun friends. And I always wanted to know, I always heard the Acadians were expelled from Canada in the middle of the 18th century. And I wanted to know the story. So Stuart and I, we went to the Canada Maritimes this past summer. We interviewed people, we visited the museums, and that's the story I'm going to tell you. We're going to talk about the Acadians, their exile, their survival, their resilience, and their creation of a new culture. So they had 2 strikes against them in the face of Britain. They were French and they were Catholic. So that didn't look too good for them. They were expelled from Canada. Some of them migrated to Louisiana, and they've had a lot of influence on American culture in terms of food, music, celebrations. They are really part of the fabric of our country, and they're part of the making of America. So now to get our bearings. So we are talking about that part of the world, northern Canada. And then some of the surviving Acadians are going to end up in Louisiana, which is many, many miles away. So now that we have our bearings, we can see a little bit closer where we are. The Acadians settled in this area of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, some of Maine, and some of Quebec. Interestingly enough, they settled first here in 1605 or 1604 on the island of St. Croix. And then they established themselves here in Port-Royal, which became Annapolis, and Grand Pré, Big Meadow. We're going to talk about that. So, and they settled here earlier than the French settlers who came to Quebec. So most people don't know that, but now you know. They were happy. They were having a nice, quiet life. That French period was called l'Acadie heureuse, the happy Acadia. So they stayed, not exactly 1604. That's when they first started. So maybe 1650 until 1755. So at least 3 generations. The name Acadia is attributed to an Italian explorer by the name of Giovanni da Verrazzano, and he explored the coastline of what's now the US from North Carolina up to Canada. And it reminded him of what he had read about the Greek notion of Acadia, like a paradise on earth. And if you don't know about him, you probably have heard or have been on the Verrazzano Bridge in New York City because he explored in that area. So then it was the name given to the area. They were self-sufficient farmers. They were also fishing. They were peaceful. They have good relations with the First Nations, the indigenous population, the Mi'kmaq. So you can see how life was good. The land was fertile. There was some water too. Everything was good. And they were very industrious. I'm not an engineer, but they are known for having done a lot of work in creating farmland from salt marshes with dikes. In French, they're called aboiteaux. So you can still visit those. You can see how they were nice with the peaceful relation with the Indian. This is like a bucolic picture of Grand Pré, Great Meadow in Nova Scotia. And this is really where the disaster happened. They were neutral, but when with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, France ceded Nova Scotia as well as the Bay of Hudson and Newfoundland. And there were skirmishes between the French and the British. So the Acadians were victims. They were an enclave between the big imperial powers, France and Britain, who were competing for hegemony in America. So they were really collateral damage. So what happened one day, very suddenly, the British decided they were going to expel the Acadians. So that was in 1755, and that, I don't know if it's in Grand Pré, but it was in that area. In French, they called it le grand dérangement, which is great upheaval. And I think it doesn't give you the full flavor of what it was. It was a deportation. The families were separated, the homes were burned. In the modern context, we would call that ethnic cleansing. And there were some between 10 and 12,000 people who were expelled. The particular cruelty was that there've been a lot of mass expulsions going back to antiquity, but it was the first time on the North American continent of Europeans deporting other Europeans and separating the families, because the idea for the British, they didn't want them to regroup. They wanted to disperse them so that they would never be, they would lose their identity. So where did they go? The first wave, they went to the British colonies in 1755. They were mistreated because nobody wanted them. So they were enslaved, indentured servants. I noticed, and that may be of interest to my friend here, that the Acadians founded Frenchtown in Baltimore, which now may not exist anymore. No, it's not true. Okay, so, excuse me, it doesn't exist anymore, yeah. So it was big in the 18th century. It's estimated that 1/3 died in shipwrecks and starvation. Now, my friend Kevin Clermont from Ithaca told me that some of them actually fled, and some of his ancestors fled to Quebec. So they were not all deported. So some were sent to the British colonies in 1755. So the poor Acadians, they left Nova Scotia, and then they thought they would be safe in Prince Edward Island. But no, the British then took those people and they sent them to England. You can see the route here that, right now we're just going to look at the blue zone and the purple zone. So the blue shows you, if it's very thick, it means it's a lot of people going. They send them on these ships to England. And from there, some of them, I don't know why I'm showing here, sorry. Some of them from England went to France. And then here you see the ones they went to Massachusetts, New York, Baltimore, Charleston. So right now we're looking at the way over, away from where they were before. Then the British took over all of Canada with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So then they were allowed to come back. And they were very strong because they may not have liked where they were and they wanted a better life. So they went back. But you can see on the red that they couldn't go back to this fertile land because in the meantime, the British colonists had settled down here. So you can see the red, they were only allowed to go to the coastline of New Brunswick, a little part of Nova Scotia, a little part of Prince Edward Island, and then Cape Breton, Cheticamp. So they had to transform themselves. They had to reestablish whatever farm they could take care of, and some of them became fishermen. So life was okay, but okay, they didn't have many rights at the beginning, early 1900. It took them a long time, a lot of perseverance to get the right to vote, the right to own land, to get instructed. They were considered illiterate. But something happened, which is marvelous and that you may know about. A professor of classics, an American, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, heard the story from a friend, and he decided to write a romantic poem in hexameter, very classic, called The Tale of Acadia. And it came out in 1847, and somehow it made the story of the Acadians known to the world. People didn't know or had forgotten. And it was quite amazing. It was taught in schools, and I know some of you have learned, have studied, so in American schools, French, not French, but American, Canadian schools. So it became, Evangeline is the main protagonist. So Evangeline is in love with Gabriel La Jeunesse. It's her fiancé. They're separated during the exile. She spends her whole life looking everywhere for him. She finally finds him on his deathbed in a hospital, but at least they get together and then he dies. It appealed to the Victorian sensibilities, but it also became world famous and a symbol of the Acadians people, perseverance and hope. So now it was translated into 130 languages. They made movies out of it. You may, 1929 movie with Dolores Del Rio. They made chocolate out of it. And then you can see the professor, and I don't know what Evangeline is doing. She doesn't wear many clothes, but she's in the forest looking for Gabriel. So they named the locomotive after Evangeline. They named cities. They commercialized Evangeline, but she did the job. So after that, toward the late 19th century, there was a revival of, I told you things were going to get better, a revival of Acadian culture and language, centered around the religion. The church was very important, kind of the center for the identity, the grouping of people. In 1884, they adopted a flag. So it has the color of France, the French flag, blue, white, red. And then the yellow is Our Lady of the Assumption, the Virgin Mary. They had a newspaper, and then they gained and they adopted an anthem. And I think that one is in Miscouche in Prince Edward Island. And we visited the museum there, which has a lot of documents and people explaining what happened when they were on the ship and so on. So they did major progress, and they even gained political power, so much so that Louis Robichaud became the Prime Minister of New Brunswick. So they really did well for themselves. So the Acadians today in the Maritimes, there are some 280,000 Acadians and Francophones in the three provinces, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. And in New Brunswick, where we were with Stuart, there are some 30% of the population speaks French. But they're having trouble because of the overall presence of English. And and you can see that in the language. There, I didn't mention where the Acadians originally came from. They came from France, the central west, like on the Atlantic coast of France, central west and southwest part of France, like the Poitou, Charente, Nantes, Poitiers. And they are distinct from the Québécois. The ones who went to Quebec were more from Normandy and Brittany. And they lived isolated from each other. So they developed their own dialect and customs and traditions. So they are distinct populations. So did you know that Canada has two official languages, English and French? And the reason, and people would say why, because everybody speaks English, it's because the French were the French first settlers, and about 30% of people speak French in Canada. So that's a different topic. So we're going to leave the Acadia now and figure out how the Acadians found their way to Louisiana. But before, I just wanted to tell you something kind of interesting. So we see Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and there is that island. That's where we went. It's called Les Îles de la Madeleine, Magdalene Islands. You take a ferry from here and it takes 5 hours and you get to that beautiful islands, which is populated by the descendants of the Acadians. And those Acadians, they came from Saint-Pierre and Miquelon in the 18th century because some of these Acadians were expelled. They went to Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, and from there they settled here. And we had a marvelous time. It's a beautiful, bucolic place. They speak mostly French because it's like the paradise for the Québécois. It's part of Quebec administratively, even though geographically it's part of the Maritimes. So they also speak English for the tourists. You know, the tourist season is the summer months. So we would go back in a heartbeat. It's beautiful. But now we're going to leave Acadia. And I spent a lot of time for the past 6 months writing a book chapter for a friend of mine on Acadians and language rights in New Brunswick, successes, challenges, and the future of French. So if you're interested, I'll give you a copy. Okay, how did the Acadians got to Louisiana? So we're going to see on a map, but briefly, they went from the British colonies, some others from New York, from Halifax in Canada. And then a lot of them went to England, France, and they were not so happy because, you know, really, the places they were sent to, nobody wanted them. So they only wanted to come back. They were stubborn about that. So in 1785, 16 more Acadians came back from France on 5 Spanish ships, because at the time, France had turned over Louisiana to Spain, and then it went back to France for a while, and then it went to the US. So they sent 5 Spanish ships because the Spanish crown was eager to populate their Louisiana colony with Catholic farmers, settlers who supplied the New Orleans residents. And then I heard that my friend over here is from the Dominican Republic. So some of them came from Santo Domingo, the way it was called at the time, because Santo Domingo at the time was a French colony. It was the pearl of the Antilles, meaning very rich, because of the work of the slaves, the sugar cane and so on, plantations. But the Haitian revolted and created the first Haitian Republic. So all the planters, the French colonists, moved back. They had to go somewhere else. So they went to Louisiana. So now on this map, we saw the return. So after 1763, some of the Acadians, you see where they went in France, Belle-Île, Nantes. Belle-Île is a beautiful little island of Brittany. I also recommend it. So they went back here, and we're looking at the green now. And then they went to Louisiana on those Spanish ships. And then some went to Louisiana from Santo Domingo. And then there was a war between France and Spain in Cuba. So the people who had gone from Santo Domingo to Cuba, they also went to Louisiana. So mainly that. And yeah, I find that amazing how they could go such long distances. Now, at some point in time, things were good for France. You know, you can see in blue all the French possessions, but not at some point, you know, already in 1765, France had turned over Canada to Britain. So this part was US, well, British, sorry, this was Spanish. So if it had continued that way, everybody, including our son Nicolas, who lives in Nebraska, would speak French. I'm trying to be inclusive here. But things didn't go well for France. So it's because you all know about the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And interestingly enough, the US didn't want the whole of Louisiana. They wanted only New Orleans and West Florida because they wanted access to the Mississippi River and the port and for commercial purposes. But they got it all for little sum, $15 million. So this is France. I just want to explain the context of who else was in Louisiana at the time. They were, okay, we're taking a quick look at Louisiana where they sent the Cajuns. So New Orleans is here. They sent the Cajuns, they settled them in the southwest region. So this is Thibodaux, Houma, New Iberia, Abbeville, Broussard. Lafayette is considered the center. Brobridge. We're going to talk, Brobridge is where they have celebrations, dancing. Eunice is where they have the Mardi Gras, Opelousas. Those are all the regions. And the Louisiana legislature has mentioned or decided to call Acadia 22 parishes to call them Acadiana. So you can see them here. Evangeline, you know, popular name, Beauregard, Acadia, Lafayette, Saint-Martin, Saint-Landry, Vermillon, Sainte Mary, all of these. And you can see the center of Acadia is here. So all these regions, very swampy, you know, not very rural. Now, you may know some people, some of your friends may be called Boudreau, Landry, Hébert, Arsenault, Babin. That indicates that they have Acadian heritage at some point. And I want to read something which is really sad, but it's a testimony to the conditions of their transport. It's a letter from the governor of Louisiana, who was Spanish at the time, to the Spanish ambassador to France, September 28th, 1766. An English sloop carrying the French Acadian families arrived here on the 28th after a voyage of 3 months when it departed Maryland. It brought 224 men, women, and children, 150 in the last two categories. During the voyage, 14 died and 3 others died after they had arrived. 3 of them were born during the trip. Because these people arrived in misery and in great need, they were helped immediately by order of the French general and myself, given drinks and biscuits. I also gave them a bull and a calf. The shipmaster assured me that as soon as they received the animals, they killed them and ate the meat raw. Yeah, it's pretty painful to read. So what did the Acadians? They didn't lose their courage. They were very strong. So they started building houses on narrow plots of land, aligned, close to the bayou. Like the bayou is like part of the delta of the Mississippi, like slow-moving rivers. Similar to what the Acadians had done, or the Quebecois, you build them in lines near the river, and from the riverbank to the swamps. So their mode of locomotion was the boat. So they would boat from house to house. And then later on, they built houses. And this photo, by the way, it's a 19th century home, but it was taken in 1974. So that shows you how life was there. What was their life like? They were self-sufficient, like they were in Acadia. They lived in isolation. They arrived in 67 toward the end of the 1700s. So they lived in isolation until industrialization, like middle of 19th century, when the trains came, and then World War I, World War II, and then the oil and gas came in. So, but the fact that they lived in isolation for so long in their rural areas meant that they transmitted their traditions from generation to generation. They were very strong in celebrations. That's a characteristic of the Acadian and the Cajun. And by the way, their name Cajun, it's a derivation of Acadian, Cajun. It's like an English pronunciation, nothing big about it. A great harm was done to them. That's why I say there are ups and downs. And it's, unfortunately, being part of a minority, you always get pushed over by the majority. So what happened, and it was part of an overall movement, the Louisiana Constitution of 1921 decreed that you couldn't speak French in high school, in the public schools. Everybody had to speak English. So the poor little Acadians, when they went to school, if they didn't know a word in English, they were punished. Or there was a sad little story that my Cajun friend told me, because I'm going to introduce you to some of my Cajun friends. When there was a little girl who needed to go to the bathroom, but she didn't know how to say it in English. And the teacher very nastily said, "You have to tell me in English." And she couldn't. And you know what happened. So it's a kind of traumatizing. Now we would say you need a psychiatrist to help you. Which means that the French language was erased from 1 or 2 generations. So that's why it's so hard to find people speaking French nowadays. When I was there in 75, I could still find people speaking French, their version of French, Cajun French, like archaic French, like instead of saying une auto, a car, they would say a char, like a cart, because that's what was the mode of locomotion many centuries ago. So what was their life like? They were fishermen, they adapted, another characteristic of the Acadians. They had skills from where they live in Acadia, but the terrain was different. It was swampy, it was subtropical, lots of mosquitoes, but they adapted everything they knew. They settled the land, they fished, they took animals. They were very resourceful. So who was there at the time? They were not alone. As I mentioned, there were other Francophones. They were colonists from France, a large Creole population in New Orleans, and French Caribbean slaves on the plantation. We talked a little bit about what is a Cajun, and we're going to talk more, but now let's turn to who is Creole. And that's very interesting, especially for Louisiana. And my example here is the Laura plantation, which was built in 1804, actually by this guy, Guillaume Duparc, who was a French soldier who had fought in the American Revolution. The French, I guess they hated the British so much that they fought with the Americans in the American Revolution, even though the Americans were not very nice toward the Acadians. I read some words from Benjamin Franklin or George Washington, pretty negative about the French. But we forget and forgive. So to be Creole, historically, the Creoles were the upper class educated white descendants of French and Spanish settlers. What made them Creole was that they were born in the new world of people who came from the old world. So it comes from criollo, which is a variation of the Portuguese and Spanish verb criar, meaning to raise, to bring up. Over time, being from here, born and raised in the colonies, it didn't matter whether you were white or black or Creole or slave Creoles or half black, half white or other ethnic background. Could be French, Spanish, African, Caribbean. And in Louisiana, especially, there was a term, a particular ethnicity called Creole of color. They were free Creoles. They had been freed by their master. They had intermarried or interacted with white people, usually white men, and they had children. And those Creoles were more urban, wealthy, and aristocratic than the, well, that's a little different, but those free Creoles of color had attained some economic gains and were almost part of the middle class. So during the French colonial period until 1803, you had a tripartite society. You had the white Creoles of French or Spanish descent. You had the free Creoles of color who became part of the economic and cultural elite to this day, like a middle class. And it was quite spread out because the white men who came from Europe, they didn't have a wife, or they had a wife, but they often took a mistress who was black, then interacted with her, and then they had children, and sometimes the man would give money and inheritance to those children. And then they could, you know, they became wealthy. They opened up businesses. They even, some of them had plantations. There is a famous plantation. So they achieved economic wealth. And that was fine under the colonial period. But then after the US purchased Louisiana, then the influence of the Anglos made it so that little by little, it was a buy. You had to be white or black. There was no in between. And now the young black Creoles, they tend to identify more with African-American people because of the Anglo-American influence since the civil rights, the civil rights movement. But you can see this beautiful young girl, you know, you can tell she comes from a wealthy background. She has a tignon, which is a bonnet that they were supposed to wear, but she looks very beautiful. And I was trying to figure out how the Cajuns, where they were in that social hierarchy. I think they were kind of aside. The Creoles, there was some upsmanship. The Creoles thought they were better. So, and the Creoles lived more in New Orleans. They were more urban. The Cajuns were on their own in the swamps, like in the rural areas. Who lived in New Orleans in 1800, it's a little bit beyond this presentation on Cajuns, but there were a lot of people, you know, refugees for Saint-Domingue. There were, you know, in early 1900, 15,000 people, whites, free blacks of color, and slaves, and then immigrants, German, Irish, Spanish, French, and then African slaves from Senegal and other parts of Africa. So some famous people who have Creole or Cajun blood. So Pope Leo XIV, you probably all know that because everybody did the genealogy. The Pope has Louisiana Creole heritage through his mother, because in the census, in the 1900 US census, they were considered Creoles of color. Her family, part of the family came from Haiti. But then they migrated, like many Black people. They moved from New Orleans to Chicago in the early 20th century to avoid the Jim Crow laws, the racist, the apartheid in the US. And then her birth certificate identified her as white. You know, that was a terrible choice to make. And then Beyoncé, I'm sure you all love Beyoncé. Beyoncé, you know, with DNA now, you discover a lot about your heritage. So her ancestor is Joseph Beausoleil Broussard, and she also has a Cajun heritage. So she's proud to have both sides. How many Cajuns today? This is kind of a mess, that slide, because I saw so many different numbers that maybe you know, you can take whatever you want from that. You know, at the end of the 19th century, 300,000. But right now, there've been so many different generations that it's hard to know who is purely Cajun, like all the family ancestors are from Acadia. It probably doesn't exist. So, you know, I don't know. We're going to stop that one. Louisiana has adopted its own Acadian flag, and you can recognize it because it has the French fleur de lis, and then the Spanish, the Castile, gold tower, and then our Virgin Mary, Lady of the Assumption. And there is an attempt at the revival of the French language now. It's really, I hope it's not a lost cause. You know, the institutions are trying very hard, the Louisiana legislature and other agencies. So there is a council for the development of French in Louisiana. So they're sending French teachers from Canada and from France. But of course, it raises some controversy, because what do you want to teach to Louisiana children? Parisian French, Canadian French, or Cajun French, which is, which is hard to understand. So I wanted to introduce my friends. They are the ones that I went to law school with. And I actually talked to Jackie this past Saturday and to Steve. So Jackie is married to Steve, and Jackie is the true Cajun, because both the sides of her family are from descent from Acadian ancestors. I mean, sometimes there's somebody from Quebec, somebody from France, but she's unfortunately part of the maybe lost generation, in a sense that her parents didn't speak French to her. They spoke French to each other so that the children wouldn't understand. But her grandmother didn't speak English at all. So, we had a nice conversation. She told me stories. So Steve was my classmate, and he was very good. He was on the law review. And I always thought he was Cajun, but he did a lot of genealogical research. And it turned out that his father was Scot-Irish, and his mother, the ancestors were from France, but they came from France via Canada, via Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and then they came down. So she told me that part of her family was Creole from France, and they did some upsmanship vis-a-vis the Cajuns. You know, that's the problem with Cajuns. They were marginalized until they became kind of trendy, and we're going to talk about that. I think I have to rush in a minute. Okay. Robert Anthony Pascal, he was my professor. he died at the ripe age of 102. And he was I was his research assistant, and he was very happy with me because I was French. And because Louisiana, as you know, has the Napoleonic Code. And when I was 22, I already had my French law degree, and then I got an American law degree because they wanted to encourage us to do comparative studies. So my topic was a comparison of French law, Louisiana civil law, and US UCC, Uniform Commercial Code. So he was very proud of his heritage, purely Creole. I'm sure his family had plantations and slaves, but he himself, very Catholic, his wife took care of prisoners, and he spoke Parisian French, pure French from France, because he was reared in New Orleans by Ursuline nuns. And then Sylvia Cooks, my good friend, another classmate, she came from a very poor background in Jeanneret. She worked in the cane fields, and then she realized she wanted to do something else in her life. So she went to law school, and she ascended in spite of all the difficulties of being a woman. There were very few women at LSU in my time, and being African American. So I don't think I don't know what her heritage is, whether she's Creole or just grew up in that part of Cajun country. But she was the chief judge of the Louisiana Third Circuit Court of Appeals, first African-American woman and first woman. So those are my wonderful friends, and I love her smile. So what is a Cajun? My friends said, to be Cajun, you don't have to be Acadian. You just have to live in the area and enjoy life. So joie de vivre, joy of life. Fedodo dance parties, they were on the square, in the past, outside. You put your child on the side, and then you sing a lullaby, which is Fedodo, mon petit ange, go to sleep, and hope the child go to sleep so that you can go dance. It's a typical Louisiana Cajun expression, Fedodo. So characteristic of the Cajuns is the importance of family, community, hospitality, and celebration. A fun fact, frog legs. You remember in French food, they always celebrate frog legs, and New Orleans, they love frog legs. So the Cajuns were the ones who got the frog legs for them, and they would ship them in oak barrels. So in 1932, I thought that was a fun fact, almost 2,000 frog legs. They're a little plumpier than those, because there's not much, I think they are bullfrogs. Okay, what the Cajuns have been successful at, and the reason they're doing well, they can adapt culturally. For instance, you see, the Acadians didn't have the accordions, but it was brought by German immigrants, and it was sold by German Jewish merchants who had stores in every Cajun town. So you can see the blending of influences. Food, on our menu here at Oak Hammock, we have gumbo soup, we have jambalaya. Those are all Cajun and Creole dishes. Cajun music is born out of French and Celtic songs with the addition of the accordion and usually two-step or waltzing. Zydeco music is distinct from Cajun music, but it's influenced by it, and then it adds African and Caribbean rhythms, blues. So the Cajun music is more country western, and Zydeco is more jazzy. Before we started here, Clifton Cheney sang Les haricots sont pas salés, the beans are not salted. And I found in my own photo book, this is a picture of me with my Cajun friend at the Beau Bridge Mardi Gras, and I went to see Clifton Cheney, and it was $1. So that brings back nice souvenir. The Cajuns were marginalized for a long time. but they were wonderful people and good soldiers. The Sambrosa in France, it was a strategic advantage to be able to speak French. So they're trying to revive the French language, and the young people, it's part of their identity. They say, we want to speak French mainly because they told us we couldn't speak French. So they're making all kinds of efforts. Jambalaya would be a Cajun dish, but influenced by African and European influences. Gumbo, it's a soupy. It starts with a soup, with a roux. Another Cajun food is crawfish étouffée that you can see here, which is also with a roux. A roux, you take flour and lard or butter, you mix with, and you mix it all, and then you add liquid. Difference between Cajun and Creole dishes, you know, Creole is more inspired by France and also more with tomatoes, but, you know, it's a almost different topic. Crawfish boils are very favorite, and then Cajun food became hot in the 80s with Chef Paul Prudhomme, who you also get blackened fish all the time. Well, thanks the Cajuns for that. Cajun music and festival, everybody loves them. You can see, so this is a carnival in Breaux Bridge. It's not glitzy like in New Orleans, it's rural. So what you do, there's a captain on a horse and he lets go of a hen, and then the little kids have to run and catch, and then supposedly you pluck the hen and you put it in the one pot gumbo to make gumbo. Okay, Evangeline, there is a statue of Evangeline both in Acadia and then down here in Saint Martinville. And right now they get together, the Cajuns of Louisiana and the Acadians, and they try to find their mutual ancestors. So it's really nice. It took almost 250 years after the deportation for the Queen to issue a proclamation admitting to the wrongs enacted against the Acadians, but they didn't give any money. And then I like this man on Google, Kevin Reese. He tries to revive the French. So he teaches French like the raton laveur, a raccoon. It's a shawi in Cajun French raton laveur, Creole, it's shawi and raccoon. And he always tells good stories. So you probably all know about when you hear Cajun, people will say, young men will say, Raging Cajun. It's the football team of Lafayette. That's all what I know about them. What I would like to say, to leave a little time for questions, is that Cajuns have helped shape America. And they are not an exception on the edge of the country. They are one of the cultures that built it. So thank you very much.
Claire, maybe I'm naive, but I don't understand when the British first drove the Acadians off the island. They needed the land, or it was simply a racist class thing?
No, they didn't like the presence of people that they considered possibly disloyal to the British Crown. And they were, because, they were victims of the competition of France and Britain for the conquest of North America. And they saw this group, very solid group of people, they probably didn't understand French speaking and Catholic, and they wanted to populate the areas with English speaking Protestant people. So it was a mass expulsion, like ethnic cleansing.
Like now?
Like now, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, maybe I came late, so maybe you already answered this, but in the state of Maine, there's an Acadia National Park. What is the connection?
Okay, I read about it and it's a little bit interesting. It was given to Maine by a rich family of British people, and it used to be called Lafayette Park. but the British people, they didn't like Lafayette being a French person. So they said, we're going to give it another name. And somebody suggested Acadia. And the British people didn't know that all the problem. I read this in the Acadia National Park website, so I think it's true. So I want to know, how many of you didn't know much about Acadians and Cajuns before? Yeah, I know it's almost Louisiana is the places where I landed in the US when I was 22. I mean, I didn't land. I flew to New York and then took a Greyhound bus to Louisiana. And I thought everybody spoke the way they do in Louisiana. And then I made a lot of Cajun friends. And when I went to see their families, they could speak in kind of their own French to me. But it was back then, I think, unfortunately, the language hasn't been passed. And for a long time, it was not, you didn't really brag about being Cajun. I think the new generation, because Cajun became fashionable, mainly because of Cajun food, then the social networks, television, the PBS, other channels, 60 Minutes, started making movies. Some of you went to an upstage at UF Performing Arts with Acadian singers in New York. They have Zydeco. Zydeco is not completely Cajun. It's more, it's a mix, distinct. So now they're proud to be Cajun, but for a long time, they felt that they were not considered as high up as some of the Anglo people. Again, being a minority.
So I'm interested in Evangeline and Longfellow and whether there was a historical something that he took to make the story, like Hiawatha is kind of, made up to, and
yeah, from
obviously everybody loves the storyline.
From what I understand, he heard the story from a friend of his who may have been Canadian, and it was in the middle of the 19th century. And then he decided to make a story out of it. So supposedly the facts, the historical facts that he recites, it's a fictional story. It doesn't exist. But it symbolizes a lot of the plights of the Acadians. Well, they love it because they love it because it has all the elements that you would love. So they united around Evangeline. That's why they name certain parts of the country in Acadia and in Louisiana, the Evangeline area. And it's in hexameter. It's a poem. It's not that easy to read. And I know, Elizabeth, you studied it in school, right? Yeah, Elizabeth says that it used to be taught. Who studied Evangeline? Yeah. So did they only do the text, or did they tell you about the context? They told the story, yeah.
Claire, was there any significance to mixing of Native American with the southwestern Louisiana Cajuns?
You mean a significant? Yeah, there was a lot. There is a lot of intermingling, and actually there was intermingling of the Acadians with the Micmacs and other tribes. It just was almost erased. You didn't talk about it. As far as I think things were better before the Louisiana Purchase, because then the Anglos came and messed up everything. No, but I think because I did ask my friend whether people, if you go to a Cajun party now, it's very, people forget about the fights. They just unite around celebration, and you call the festivals Acadian and Creole. So you do have people mix, but I think in the 50s or 60s, they probably wouldn't mix as much. But I hope people are more tolerant and just happy to be together.
Claire, I never thought of it before, but probably because I never heard a talk that included Quebec and Cajuns. How do Quebecois feel about Cajuns? Is there any affinity? Is it completely separate? I have no idea.
I think they feel an affinity. I think the affinity, and for me, it's the same. It's the French language. Like when I first arrived and when my parents would come to visit and we would go to Quebec or the Montreal airport, they were elated just to hear French buzzing around. So the Quebecois are like, they're at the center of Francophonie because, you know, French is a major language in the world. You know, I never remember statistics. It's the 5th most spoken language. And you may not realize it, but it's mostly because of Africa, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the Quebecois are the center of Francophonie, the push for the promotion of French in the world, and anything that's French. So they are in contact. Canada and Louisiana are in contact. The French love Louisiana. There are special trips arranged to see their brothers in Louisiana. So, you know, I'm a little bit past that now to hear French. I don't get it so excited, but at the beginning, I was very excited.
Any other questions?
You feel they are your cousins. So did anything surprise you? Do you want to dance now? Because I have some dance music.
Oh, we got some on Zoom here. Who are some famous Americans of Cajun descent?
Some famous, well, I mentioned Beyonce. Do you want to go beyond that? Another one was Edwin Edwards, the governor of Louisiana. So he's famous too.
And the next question is, can a French citizen readily understand the speech of a Cajun French?
It depends where they've been schooled. You know, it's like a Quebec French. If it's somebody from a small village, I may have trouble. If it's somebody who's been tutored in a larger city, I think I will understand. It's hard. It's especially hard. The songs are even harder. But I think you can make do a little bit of French, and then you speak with your hands.
And the last question is, how different are the variations in French speaking Louisiana, Caribbean, Vietnam, Quebec, France?
Well, Vietnam, I don't know exactly. Caribbean, well, that would be a whole topic, you know. It's and for instance, I can mention yet another one. It's called Chiac, C-H-I-A-C. That's what they speak in New Brunswick. It's a mix of French and English. Like, for instance, I'm going to start the car. Je vais starter la voiture. You know, it's like you put French, English words in the middle of French words. So I think you have to get used to it. But I'm glad you mentioned Vietnamese because there are a lot of Vietnamese people in Louisiana now. And I'm thinking in the broad context, they can also be part of the Cajuns, you know, because they live there. You can be from Texas, and then you're Cajun because you enjoy all the parties. I think that's why I promised you, laissez les bons temps rouler, let's the good time roll. And to me, the Quebecois are the same way compared to the other Canadians. You know, you can tell they like to party and enjoy life. I think it takes a little longer for other people. So I'm sure you have meetings to go to or exercise to do. So thank you very much.